Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our program today, our KJ webinar series, which is sponsored by the KJ Men's Club for the entire KJ community. And Dr. Mark Meirowitz here, president of the KJ Men's Club. And today we have a tremendous honor and privilege to hear from Shoshana Bryen, the senior director of the Jewish Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and the editor of the In Focus Quarterly. Now, I just wanted to mention just a few quick words. First of all, I want to extend a tremendous shout out and thank you to Effie Landau, our KJ intern, who has worked very hard on this to put this together, and of course to the KJ office. And our thanks also to Rabbi Steinmetz for his inspiration to do this series. And thank you, Rabbi Steinmetz, and thank you to the whole KJ organization. Now, in terms of our procedure, we would be very, very happy for you to put your questions in the chat. And as we go along, we will address the question. We'll pose them to Shoshana, and we look forward to a very, very exciting discussion. I'm going to say a few words about Shoshana, and welcome, Shoshana, first of all. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm going to say a few words about Shoshana, a little bit about what the program is going to be about, and then we'll proceed. Shoshana Bryen has more than 30 years of experience as an analyst of U.S. defense policy and Middle East affairs. She has run programs and conferences with American military personnel in the U.S., Israel, Jordan, Taiwan, and elsewhere, and has worked on strategic studies issues for the U.S. Army War College, the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, the National Defense University, and JINSA, and she has written extensively in many publications, Wall Street Journal, New York Sun, Forbes.com, too many to mention, and has created innovative programs on the Middle East for American military professionals. She's a member of the advisory board of the Alethea Foundation that provides opportunities for wounded veterans of the Iran and Afghanistan wars, and is a member of the board of the Naval Academy Jewish Chapel and the American Jewish International Relations Institute. I also should mention that Shoshana has honored us by coming to KJ and speaking to us on our Kiddush discussion programs, which were wonderful programs and so well received, and we were excited to invite her here today for this webinar. Now, Shoshana, I'm just going to say very quickly, and we'll turn it over to her thematically, and these are actually her words and I want to also welcome those individuals, of course, from KJ, but those who are here today from the Jewish Policy Center. We're quite excited that you're joining us as well. The Arab Spring divided Arab negotiations with Israel into before and after. Camp David, the Jordan Peace Treaty, and the Oslo Accords on one side, and the Abraham Accords, Morocco and Sudan on the other. American policy during and after the Arab uprising, along with the rising threat from Iran, forced Arab governments to take their own people's requirements and aspirations into account. The old peace process pressured Israel to make potentially dangerous concessions on security and territory to Palestinian leaders who kept insisting that Jews had no history in Jerusalem and no rights to a homeland. But 30 years later, there's a generational shift. And backed by former President Trump, the Gulf states have now put their own people's economic, social, and security interests ahead of the Palestinian veto. I'm going to turn it over now for Shoshana's remarks. And thank you again, Shoshana, for honoring us with the privilege of learning from you and hearing from you today. Shoshana Bryen.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, people of KJ, for having me. The Kiddush lectures I gave there were among my favorites. You guys are a great audience. So I'm happy to be back with you, even in this format. Now, Mark has just given the beginning of my remarks, which is to explain that when you look at Israeli security and you look at peace processes, there's more than one, there is a distinct divide between those that came early and those that are presently emerging. And there is a bridge between the two. So if we look at the first of the agreements, it was Egypt-Israel, Camp David Accords. Sadat had lost the 67 war, Egypt had lost the 73 war. They were very unhappy with the Russians militarily, and they wanted to get rid of them. So Sadat threw out Russian military and Russian advisors, and he wanted Americans. And we obliged him in the 70s with care for Israel's position that we helped the Egyptians rebuild their military, among along more Western lines. In 78, Jimmy Carter wanted to have a US-Russian peace conference on the Middle East. And Sadat said, son of a gun, everything I worked so hard to get rid of is back. And he didn't want the Russians. And he figured the best way not to have the Russians back in the Middle East was to go to Israel himself and make peace with Israel. And between the Israelis and the Egyptians, he figured they would keep the Russians out. That is what happened. He gave Israel what Israel required: recognition, legitimacy, conversation, peace, came out of the circle of war-making states. But there was no desire on Sadat's part or Mubarak's part when he came after to actually work with Israel. I will remind you, for those of you who are as old as I am, there was an Israeli city in the Sinai, the northern Sinai, called Yamit, and the Israelis offered it to Egypt as a joint Israel-Egypt desert agriculture center. Because who knows more about desert agriculture than Israel? Actually, nobody. So Begin thought, well, this is a good way for us to make people-to-people contact. And he offered it, and Sadat said, no, out of the Sinai, everybody out of the Sinai. So Yamit left the Sinai, the Israelis left the Sinai. There was no Israeli activity in Cairo other than an official presence. It was not designed to work together. It was designed for Sadat to get what he wanted from the United States. I am not criticizing it. It was a good deal for Israel. Israel took the largest Arab state out of the war coalition. Jordanians, the same thing, basically. The Jordanians wanted US foreign aid. They wanted US military aid. It was in their interest to make a deal with Israel, to get Israeli security for their borders. But when it came to things like qualified economic zones, where Jordanians could work in Israeli factories inside Jordan, they didn't want to work there. The Jordanian government didn't want them in Amman. They put them out in the desert. They made sure nobody could find them. The Jordanians were in it for what they could get from the United States. Again, not complaining, just saying. Oslo Accords, basically same thing. Palestinians are not interested in working with Israel, doing with Israel, being with Israel. They want the United States and the Quartet and the EU as a bludgeon to make Israel do things. That's your first group of guys. Now, then you get to the intervening factor. The intervening factor is the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring can be defined in 4 words: corruption, money, sex, and humiliation. And now that I have your attention, let's talk about the Arab Spring. And I will get to those 4 words. After the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and into the Obama administration, the United States administration thought the Arabs were missing something. They were missing what? They were missing democracy or freedom, what we call freedom. Condoleezza Rice, for whom I have great respect, said that freedom was the universal yearning of the human heart. President Obama wanted to atone for what he considered the sins of white people in the Middle East. But the Arabs were not waiting for those things. The Arabs understood fully well by 2011 that they had a problem. They had a problem with corruption. They had a problem with their own people, endemic corruption. And corruption, really, the definition of corruption is that you can't get anything done unless you pay somebody. And so there were lots of people in Egypt and in Tunisia who couldn't get anything done because they didn't have somebody to bribe and they didn't have the money to bribe them. But the opposite of corruption is not democracy. The opposite of corruption is justice. And so you saw people in 2011, 2012 with signs that wanted justice for the people. Democracy was the wrong answer. So when we got rid of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, we didn't help, we hurt actually. The goal should have been how to get people into the economic system. In other words, to get them money. Now, why do you need money? In the Arab world, you need money because, what should we say? Money brings you sex? No, not exactly. But money is how you get married. And married is not just sex, but marriage is your family, your children, your job, and your place in the world. There is no swinging singles life in the Arab world. You don't get to be 22 and leave your father and mother's house and go live in the city. You live in your parents' house until you get married. And when you're married, you're an adult. If you don't have money and you can't get married, you're not really an adult. And that leads you to the 4th point, which is humiliation. So it's no surprise that actually the Arab Spring was touched off by an illegal vegetable cart. How can a cart be illegal? The guy tried to get a permit in Tunisia to put his vegetable cart on the street. He didn't have the people to pay off. He put the vegetables out anyway, and the police came and they overturned the cart. And he had just had it. This young man had just had it. He lit himself on fire and he killed himself. And what he did resonated enormously with hordes of hopeless young people across the Middle East and North Africa who didn't see any way to get ahead. They didn't see any way to get from my father's son to a grown-up man with a wife, with kids, with a job. So they're stuck because of the corruption, because of the lack of money. They can't take the next two steps, which is to get married and to be a full adult, which is humiliating. By the way, it's not a surprise then that jihadists are recruited with the concept of what? 72 virgins. What does 72 virgins mean? It means sex without money, sex without humiliation, sex without a job. It is, I don't know, it's the aspiration for a lot of young men. Not the sexual part, but the growing up part, the being an adult part. So we looked at the Arab Spring and we said, oh, well, these people don't have good government. Let's get rid of their leaders. And we got rid of Mubarak, and we got rid of Muammar Gaddafi, and we jumped into the Syrian civil war, and we had gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we did not replace Saddam Hussein with anything workable. And at the same time, you have the Iranians rising in the region. The conservative Arab states got hives. I mean, that's a nice way to say it. They got hives. They didn't know what to do. The smart ones among them started sending their kids to school to do useful things, agriculture, building, trading, factories, making cars, making whatever, making computers. The smart ones began to involve their young people in their own economies. Now, if you look around the region and you say to yourself, with whom can I do this? Are you going to get like technical advice from the Palestinians? Not unless you want to build a bomb. Lebanon had gone to hell by then. Syria had gone to hell by then. Where are you going to find a partner for building your country? The partner is Israel. And all through the 2000 teens and up until today, the conservative Arab states have been working with Israel. You have Israeli dripper technology in Saudi Arabia. There was an Israeli trade mission in Abu Dhabi. There were people from UAE and Bahrain talking to Israelis in various places, and Israeli technology moving to the Gulf because the attitude changed. The leadership attitude changed. It was no longer about reversing the Middle East timeline and getting rid of Israel, going back to 47. It was no longer about Palestinians. It was about how do I stay in power? And by the way, they've been pretty good at it. I will just point out to you that I don't know if you saw it. The UAE launched a Mars probe about 6 weeks ago, and it actually got to Mars, and it actually orbited Mars. The interesting thing about having done it is, first of all, it was people of the UAE. It was not Russians or Americans or French who came and ran their factories. It was people from the UAE. The chief scientist on the mission was a woman. More than 40% of the scientific staff of that mission were women. So you clearly see that these guys have figured out, first of all, as President Clinton said, you can't run a country with half of your brains hiding in the closet. You need all your people, number one, and you need them to do concrete and constructive things. So that's what they were doing. That's what they have been doing. And now you're starting to see it come out. And once you lose that inhibition, and the inhibition says, okay, we're not going back. It's not 1948. It's 2017, 2018, 2019. It takes very little to push you then over the top into the next phase. And the next phase was provided by then President Trump, who said, don't wait for the Palestinians. You don't have to wait. You can move ahead and we will stand behind you. And what does it mean when the United States says we'll stand behind you? Well, that's problematic because as you saw with President Bush and President Obama, it's not a partisan thing. When we make mistakes, we make big ones. And they were concerned. But when the US embassy moved to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, the Arabs went, oh, son of a gun. He meant it. When the US recognized Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights, they said, oh, he meant it. He means it. He's going to stand with us. And by the way, he was standing against Iran. So you have the push me, pull you thing here. The push me thing was the Arabs are being pushed by Iran's machinations in the region. The Syrian civil war, if it wasn't enough to scare you, then you're not paying attention. And the US had a hand in making that mess as well. You have the collapse of Lebanon, you have the collapse of Iraq. You have Iran just moving farther and farther out. The Houthis giving Iran a base at the heel of the boot of Saudi Arabia at the bottom of the Red Sea. This makes people nervous in Jordan. It makes people nervous in Egypt, in Israel, in Sudan. You wonder why Sudan, right, made a deal with Israel. Part of it is that you've got Iran in the Red Sea and it makes Sudan nervous. So there is the threat pattern on the one side, but there's also the pull me part. So there's the push me part, the pull me part. Pull me part is, can I pull Israel into my orbit? Can I get something that I need? And you can, and they did, and they are. And that is the difference between the two sets of accords. Now, if you want to see how that plays out, really, I'll give you the bottom line. I'll give you the bottom line. Two things were in recently that I thought, one was just really interesting, and the other I think is fabulous. The interesting thing is that there's a fatwa agreed upon between Saudi Arabia and Egypt that the third place that Muhammad went, the third holiest city in Islam, is not Jerusalem. It's a city about 20 miles from Jeddah. And a Saudi prince, a rather major, not Mohammed bin Salman, but a Saudi prince, said Muslims should pray toward Mecca because praying toward Jerusalem is a mistake, because Jerusalem is not the city. Jerusalem's not the place. The Egyptians said that this week again. Jerusalem is not the place. It's not our third holiest city. It's not our holy city. So it shows you that they're making space for Israel in the region. And that's where you get to my very favorite thing. And I'm going to stop there and do questions. And Mark's probably got 7,000 of them by now. The best is the establishment of the Bet Din of Arabia. So for anybody who wants to know how serious the Gulf Arab states are about having relations, A, with Israel and B, with Jews, there's a Bet Din in Arabia. It's going to be headquartered in Bahrain. It has two rabbis, the chief rabbi of the Council of the Emirates, which is Yehuda Sarna, and the senior rabbi of the Council of the Emirates, Eli Abadi, who will be the presiding rabbi. And I'm just going to quote these two statements because they are amazing. Rabbi Abadi said, and I'm going to read it, this dates back to the Treaty of Umar and the recognition from the advent of Islam of Judaism as a bona fide monotheistic religion and people of the book. He noted that Jewish communities in Muslim lands were historically given, quote, religious autonomy to adjudicate their own personal status issues. Rabbi Sarna adds to that, the very presence of a rabbinical court is a signal of integration into local society. So exploration of how a rabbinical court interlocks with local judicial departments is really a larger question of how the Jewish community can become integrated into the fabric of Gulf countries. If you had said that was going to happen 12 months ago, I'd have taken the bet. But here we are, and here's the Bet Din of Arabia. And I think I probably have laid a lot on your plates. So if there are questions, I propose that we move to them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Shoshana. I'm going to start, and I want to encourage everyone to please post questions in the chat. That's very, very helpful to us. And I know you all have questions because Shoshana literally just covered the entire panorama of the Middle East in about 10, 15 minutes. But, you know, I learned this principle in Yeshiva University in my first political science class from Dr. Dunner, cui bono, who benefits? And to me, I'm interested in understanding really from the point of view of interest. Are these accords really, for real? It looks like they sound very, very good. I mean, as you've described it, but there've been trade-offs for each part of the deal. For example, the UAE asked the US to commit to providing the F-35s, which now has been put on hold by President Biden. Morocco asked for recognition of the Western Sahara. Sudan asked for, and I think got, a provision that Americans who have been have lawsuits, litigants against jihadists cannot sue Sudan for damages. So each of these elements has some sort of a trade-off. And I do see the baked-in of Arabia, when actually we had the privilege of having Rabbi Abadi as our guest in the last Sunday's webinar, so it's a wonderful transition. Do you think this, I mean, the way you describe it is very hopeful, very optimistic. But if all the trade-offs don't come around, by the way, one thing that was kind of interesting that you mentioned was about the embassy being moved from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. And I was reading that the United States can't, I'm sorry, you're right, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Thank you. That's very, very significant. It turns out that the United States sold the building in Tel Aviv, so they can't move it back because there's nothing to move it back to. But the point is that Biden doesn't seem to be reversing these, so far, any of these steps. And Tony Blinken was quite, and with the Senate confirmation hearing was quite, and the senators quite approving of it. So, Cui Bono, can you tell me who benefits and how do you see this in a point of view of interest in all these trade-offs?
Okay, leave aside for the moment Blinken and Biden, because that's a separate issue, okay?
Okay.
Who benefits? It would be unreasonable to expect countries to do something for nothing. So Western Sahara, the only person in the United States Congress who was holding out for Western Sahara to be independent was a single senator. And I do not see why we should have put US prestige behind the Western Sahara. It's a terrorist front run by Algeria. So there was no reason for us not to agree with Morocco on that one. There was no reason for us to have done the opposite prior to that. F-35s to UAE. Okay, a couple of things. Remember first that they won't get them for 10 years. 10 years minimum, which means that if this thing doesn't last for 10 years, they'll never get them. So it's not like they're getting them on Tuesday morning. So there is a period of time. Secondly, remember that what Israel has, not veto power, but sort of veto power over is arms sales to Arab countries that change the qualitative military edge. And the qualitative military edge means any reasonable group of Arab countries, conventionally armed, that poses a threat to Israel. Now, the UAE is in the middle of laying out an oil and natural gas pipeline that's going to run through Israel to the Mediterranean Sea. The likelihood that UAE will then decide to bomb its own pipeline inside of Israel is slightly ridiculous. UAE has taken concrete steps to show you that it wishes to be integrated with Israel. The idea that it's going to change its mind and it's going to drop a bomb on Israel and it's going to join some Saudi group against Israel, or it's going to join Iran against it's ridiculous thinking. And you have 10 years to let it play out. So I'm not worried about UAEs. And the Sudan thing, by the way, is not exactly correct. People have sued, people have done their cases. Sudan has put up the money already. There are hundreds of millions of dollars in a US court in escrow waiting for people to have their cases adjudicated. Sudan, which has, by the way, a new government since the time that it was harboring terrorists, which has arrested Omar al-Bashir, the guy who's wanted by the International Criminal Court. They don't want future liabilities. And I really can't say that that's unreasonable for Sudan, since they did put up the money already. They're looking at future liability. So I don't have any problem with these things. You have to give people something. So you give them something. But who benefits is the people and the governments of the region. Now, Blinken and Biden, no, they're not going to do anything against the Abraham Accords. They would be entirely foolish. But what they have done is two things. As regards Israel, they're basically saying, look, the Abraham Accords are a great thing. All these new friends that you have, you're safe now. You have no security worries now. Everything's fine now. We're going to take care of Iran, but you have no more Arab enemies. So you can now give the Palestinians the state that they want because it doesn't threaten you. Well, I have news for them. Yes, it does. So but that's what they're saying. We are not going to take back the Abraham Accords. We're not going to minimize the Abraham Accords, but because you have the Abraham Accords, you can now go forward and settle with the Palestinians. It's backwards and it's wrong. It's the same kind of wrong it was without the Abraham Accords. peace process, two-state solution doesn't work, won't work, will never work. You'll have to invite me back because that's another whole lecture. But that's Blinken. And President Biden has done something even a little bit more disconcerting. He is undermining Israel's partners. The slap at Saudi Arabia was a direct way of saying, don't be friends with them. We want to talk to Iran. You have to figure out how to live with Iran, not with Israel. There was a little kerfuffle this week. I don't know if you caught it, over this investment fund. There is a $10 billion investment fund that will go into Israel. According to some people, it was supposed to be a secret. I don't know how you can make $10 billion a secret. That's what. But Bibi Netanyahu was going to go to the UAE, and he was going to meet at the airport with the sheikh, and there was a rumor that he was going to meet with Mohammed bin Salman, all this sort of stuff. And all of a sudden, the trip disappeared under sort of weird circumstances. There is another rumor, because all of it is rumors in the Middle East, that the Biden people didn't want it to happen. They didn't want it to happen. So on the one hand, they're saying, great, you've got these Abraham Accords, but now, guys, we have this other set of interests. And so now you have to focus on my other set of interests. It is problematic. It's not overtly ugly. I don't think it ever will be, but it undermines the relations between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. And that is not good. And they all worry, by the way, together, they all worry about Iran, and the Biden people want to talk to Iran. The Biden people are hoping to make nice with Iran, just as they did with the Houthis.
Shoshana, Major General Larry Taylor has a question, very, very interesting. He says, obviously Sadat wanted daylight between Egypt and USSR, but wasn't part of his motivation also that he realized that he just could never win a war with Israel? What do you think?
Absolutely. General Larry Taylor, who's one of the smartest military guys I know, hi Larry, is absolutely right. There is a story, I have told it, and I don't think it was, Larry might have been there. I met once with a group of American generals with the Israeli Chief of Staff, Dan Shomron, who was the commander of the Israeli forces in '73, who crossed the Suez Canal, and he was less than 100 kilometers from Cairo. And Shomron tells the story. He said, I got a call from a man who said he was an Egyptian general, and I was to get in a Jeep by myself with no weapons and go to X place, and he was going to meet me there and we were going to talk. So Shomron says, I either was going to die or I was going to hear something very interesting. Shomron decided to do it. He took the Jeep, he went to the place, and there was indeed an Egyptian general by himself in a Jeep, no gun. And he said, the Egyptian said, I am here to tell you that the war is over. And Shomron laughed and he said, look, I am across the Suez Canal and I'm 70 kilometers from Cairo and I know the war's over. The general said, no, the real war. In 1948, we got to 10 kilometers from Tel Aviv and you pushed us back. In 56, you came to the Suez Canal, but you cheated because you had the British and the French. In 67, you came to the canal again, all by yourselves. 73, you crossed the canal, you're 70 miles from Cairo. I am here to tell you that you will get no closer to Cairo than this. The big war is over. Shomron got back in his Jeep. He went back to his people. He made his report. Nobody believed him, but it was true, General Taylor. It was true. The Egyptians were tired of losing wars to the Israelis. The Russians weren't going to get them where they wanted to go. They wanted the Russians out.
As a postscript to that is Daniel Moynihan's book, UN, A Dangerous Place. And wasn't there part of the factor that each time Israel was poised for a complete victory, the United Nations and the international community institutions came along and forced Israel to a ceasefire? Yes. And this is why I think we shouldn't be trusting United Nations intervention, certainly in big power conflicts. But how do you assess that part of it in terms of the UN's functioning then and maybe even now? Would be interesting to know what you think.
Well, the UN was the proximate cause of the '67 war. They pulled their peacekeepers out. They had no business doing that, and they did it, which is why you have the multinational force in the Sinai ever since Camp David, which is not a UN force. It's a US organized multinational force, and it does a really good job. And the Egyptians like it and the Israelis like it. And it's been very helpful to both sides, particularly after the jihadi operations in the Sinai after Morsi spent a year as president of Egypt, releasing all kinds of radical people into the Sinai, and Iran armed them. So the UN is useless, hopeless, not a friend, whatever, but there are ways around the UN. And as long as the countries see it in their interest to cooperate. It doesn't matter what the UN says, basically.
Claire Lopez has an interesting question. Claire says, Saudis are, quote, keepers of the two holy places. So how do they maintain that Islamic authority while opening relations with Jews when anti-Semitism and antipathy towards Jews is core in Claire's view of the Islamic doctrine? How do they balance that?
They don't balance it, actually. Thank you for the question, Claire. It's a good question and an important question. There was a period of time when Islam and Judaism in the Arabian Peninsula were, I don't want to say they were friends, but they were certainly good enough neighbors. And Jews have lived in the Arabian Peninsula, in Arabia and in Yemen, and in all of those places for many, many years until 1948, 1949, when they were expelled. There's no reason in historic Islam for Jews not to be considered brothers and partners. It doesn't happen very often. And certainly it hasn't happened since you have the Shiite revolution in Iran in 1979 that goes right back to the Sons of Pigs and Monkeys. But you also have a Sunni strain of that. Periodically, reformers pop up in Islam and they want to get past that, or they want to set it aside. And you have one of those moments now. Do I think it will last forever? No, I do not. Do I think we should use it for what it's worth and use Saudi religious authority for what it's worth right now? Yes, I do.
To the point that you made before about the Palestinian trajectory versus the Abraham Accords, two roads diverged in the wood. It looks like we're going down a good direction here. But when President Trump had the representatives of the various states at the White House, one noticed that in each of the statements, they were very careful, I suppose, to say, well, look, this does not interfere with our commitment to the rights of the Palestinians and the rights of, so that's part one. Part two is segueing from that to the Biden administration and the way they're sort of posturing about the Middle East. It sounds like they're nostalgic for the Palestinian trajectory. So how do we balance those two, I think, somewhat worrisome factors that might undermine this?
They're not worrisome. Well, one is worrisome, one is not. I had the pleasure or the privilege of being at the White House for that moment when the president and the prime minister and 3 Arab ambassadors were standing there doing their thing. There is no reason the Palestinians cannot enter the 21st century and find a place for themselves in the Middle East as something good. There's no reason that they can't. And President Trump was clear on that. Netanyahu's been clear on that. And the Arab states are clear on that. The question is twofold. First of all, whether the Palestinians have to come first or not. And the answer is clearly no, they do not. I've argued that for a long time. The Palestinians are basically the weak brother. They could never have been expected to go first because everybody else was bankrolling them. So they could never say, listen, I don't care about your money. I'm going to go make peace with Israel. They were always going to be the last. So now they have company. And the question remains for them, do they want to play or don't they want to play? And the answer is no, they do not want to play. But they can no longer keep everybody else from playing. The Arabs have a slightly different view of it now. Even the Jordanians, who are being very not nice this week, talked about the role of Jordan as the keeper of holy places in Jerusalem and kind of wiggled around the question of Palestinians and Palestinian authority and all that sort of stuff. So Palestinians in or Palestinians out, it's their choice, but they won't hold up anybody else. The Biden people, of course, they want to go back to the Palestinian track. It is the only one they know. They know it. They're comfortable with it. They've been there before. They were wrong before, and they're wrong again if they think that they can manage that as a separate track. The Palestinians just announced again, in case you weren't clear on it, that they all, in this election that they're planning to have, whether they have it or not, they are all committed to the Palestine National Charter. Palestine National Charter still says Israel is an illegitimate entity in the space. I don't care how many times people tell you they've changed the charter. They have not changed the charter. It's still out there. You can find it. It's on the line. It's on the web. They are beholden to the Palestinian National Charter. They don't want to do this. They cannot admit where the state of Israel will be. I mean, look, there's a simple way to figure this out. ask the Palestinian delegation to any peace conference, which cities will be in the state of Israel when the map is drawn. Don't ask them to draw the map. I mean, you would think they could, but they can't. So is Hebron going to be in Israel? I doubt it. Is Ramallah going to be in Israel? No. Is Safat going to be in Israel? Is Haifa going to be in Israel? Is Tel Aviv going to be in Israel? What's going to be inside of Israel? You will not get an answer to that question. And as long as you can't get an answer to the question, which space is legitimate for the state of Israel when it's over, they're not serious. And the Biden people, I think they know that, but they hope they can talk their way out of it. They won't.
Turning back to the issue of Iran, which you touched on, Charlie Greenberg asks, that's a very important question. He says the Wall Street Journal reported this week that China is buying Iranian oil. What influence does China now or in the near future play in the Middle East? And to that point, the deal that they just entered into, this 25-year deal, and the rise of the relations with China and the United States at the meeting in Anchorage. How do we connect the dots on all this, and how do you see that? Should we be very concerned that Iran is getting a good supporter in China, is going to be able to leverage its power over the Middle East and Israel?
Look, China has big plans. They have what's called the Belt and Road Initiative over the top of the Middle East, from Central Asia into the Middle East, ending down in Iran. But there's also a southern end to the Belt and Road Initiative, which goes through the Red Sea, out the bottom, Indian Ocean, back up the Pacific Islands on the other side. They want to encircle half the globe. That's their goal. And by the way, this has to do with the Uyghurs as well. So you know that what China's doing in Xinjiang is a genocide. They are killing the Uyghurs. It is out of character for China. I mean, it's just not something they've basically done in their history. Why are they doing it now? Because they used to look to their east, to the Pacific Ocean, to do their business. They're now looking west overland. And the Uyghurs, which are Turkic people, not Han Chinese, they're Turkic Muslims, are related to the people of Central Asia. And the Chinese see them as a potential fifth column. And so they're getting rid of them so that they can go right through Xinjiang into Central Asia without Central Asian people inside of China. So yeah, China has big plans. The only Chinese military base outside of Chinese territorial waters is in Djibouti, next to the US base in Djibouti. They have other bases, not bases, they have other ports that they control along Peshawar in Pakistan. They want to go up the Indian Ocean, big plans. Iran would give them a base in the Persian Gulf. Now, are they going to use it to shoot people? Highly unlikely, actually. What they're really doing is trying to tie up the natural resources of the world, and they're doing a very good job of it. So sitting on the Persian Gulf, they don't have to kill anybody. They would like to be able to control the flow of oil. If you control the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf, out of the Red Sea, which is where Saudi Arabia exports from and other people export from, and you control it through the Indian Ocean and up Asia and the Asian islands, you can keep oil away from a lot of countries that are America's friends and allies, like Korea, South Korea, like Japan, like Taiwan, like the Philippines, like Indonesia. You control, by controlling the natural resources, you control the behavior of those countries, and that's what they're in it for. So no, I would not be worried about them bringing, thousands of Chinese soldiers and missiles. But yes, it is a big problem, because if they manage to control the sea lanes and the resources, everybody else is in trouble. Which is why, by the way, killing the Keystone Pipeline has got to be the dumbest thing any president of any party in any time ever did. We were energy independent for the first time since 1957, and now we're not. Come on.
Well, just on China for a moment, in terms of its behavior in India and the Galwan Valley, and it appears that their actions, and also in Philippines, to use militia to put them on, quote, fishing boats and interfere with Philippine waters. And the whole point that you make about pushing out, certainly through obviously the Straits of Malacca, to expand, and the String of Pearls and the ports, is a whole strategy. But what concerns me, would love your take on the recent meetings in Anchorage between the United States and China, where the tone of which was quite almost like two ships passing in the night. China said, well, you have a democracy, we have a democracy, but Americans have no faith in democracy. And Tony Blinken had said his thing and they said their thing, and it just got more and more contentious. What's your take on that in terms of your comments on China and where you think China's going? Because this really, it's concerning. Are you concerned?
Yes, hugely concerned. I wish Tony Blinken had bitten his tongue, because calling out the Chinese representative in public and then allowing him to take over the microphone, not that Blinken had a choice, to get it back in the face. I mean, this is all unnecessary. What we need to be doing is those things that China doesn't want us to do. And here again, I fault the Biden administration, because they have allowed the Chinese to back into our electrical grid. This is an example. We are now able to buy bulk power again from China, which means that Chinese facilities will come into the country. That means they can be sabotaged. The one thing you would not want to do is have Chinese hands on the American electrical grid. You would not want China to be responsible for all of the mining of rare earth minerals. You would not want China to be supplying all of the motherboards and components for computers that go into the United States military. There are a lot of things that you don't want China to do, but you could stop them from doing by executive action. President Trump stopped a lot of it. He got Huawei out of our 5G. He stopped the bulk purchase of Chinese electrical power. President Biden overturned both of those. So on the one hand, Tony Blinken is up there saying, I'm going to punch you in the nose. And on the other hand, giving China exactly what China wants. So the Chinese say to themselves, this is great, because rhetorically, they're angry. Rhetorically, they're going to pop off at the mouth. But when it comes to what we need and we want, we get. It's a totally backwards approach to China. China's 30 years away from being the manufacturing hegemon it wants to be. That's how much time we have left. That's it. And there's so much we can do. There's so many ways to stifle them, particularly now that we need manufacturing jobs in the United States. A lot of ways to do it. We don't need to be belligerent standing up there in Alaska. That was really, in my opinion, really dumb.
Lorelei Ennis asks a very important, brings us back to the Middle East by saying, well, what about the Belt and Road or China policy to build ports in Israel? That's, I think, very controversial in Israel. How does that all fit in? And what do you think about it? Should they pursue it or do something about it or let it proceed? What do you think?
It is a hugely important question, Lorelei. Thank you. And thank you for tuning in today. China's view of Israel and Israel's view of China is not the same as the US view of China. We take a much harder, or at least we did in the Trump administration, take a much harder line. The Israelis and the Americans together are working out how to deal with that. Israel has given up a lot of its high-level security trade with China, not because it necessarily wanted to or planned to, but because the United States wanted it to. There's an Israeli general who talks about red lights and green lights and yellow lights. It used to be, he said, that there were certain red lights, couldn't do those things, and lots of green lights, you could do those things. Everything today is yellow. The Israelis have to figure out what they can and cannot do. I am most concerned about the Haifa port, because the US Navy has been docking in the Haifa port, again, after it hadn't for quite some time. Back in the Reagan years, and then thereafter, there were US ships all the time in Haifa port. And they were coming back, but it would be very difficult for the US Navy to go to Haifa now if the Chinese are, watching. So yes, Lorelei, if there is something that I worry about as regards Chinese-Israeli relations, that is it. China, I would point out, is not in Israeli high-speed telecommunications. They never have been. So they don't have that problem. We have to deal with that problem, and the Europeans have to deal with that problem. But the port thing is enormously important.
I think you spoke before about the Houthis and the Saudis and Yemen. And I love the title of an article you wrote called Yemen, Watch the Magician. Could you deconstruct, recently attacks by the Houthis against Saudi interests and so forth, and the United States actually took the Houthis off the terrorist list. Can you deconstruct or connect these dots to understand, well, what's really going on there, and how do you analyze it?
Okay. First of all, rhetorically, you have to understand, we tend to call this the Saudi war in Yemen. That's what people call it. There is a Saudi war in Yemen. And yes, indeed, the Saudis have been bombing things in Yemen. And yeah, they're not all that good at it. We've really had to try to teach them how to stay away from certain places and people and things like that. But it's not the Saudi war in Yemen. It is Iran's war against Saudi Arabia being fought from Yemen. Iran has no bases in the Red Sea. It is in the Persian Gulf. So it threatens the countries in the Persian Gulf. But if it could have a base in the Red Sea, it would threaten then other countries, Saudi Arabia from its other side. Not to mention it is Jordan's only sea access anywhere. The Aqaba, Eilat Aqaba Free Trade Zone is in the Red Sea, Israel and Jordan together. Sinai, it's how ships go into the Suez Canal and out of the Suez Canal through the Red Sea. The US base in Djibouti is in the Red Sea. So the Iranians won't have a presence there. So they have been arming and training Houthis. They also use Yemen as a test bed for Iranian weapons. Some of the missiles that have been shot from Yemen into Saudi Arabia and into Malbi are Iranian precision guided missiles. And you know the Houthis do not build them. So if there is one group of people less able to manage human rights at the same time it fights a war than the Saudis, it is the Houthis. And they are really just monstrously destructive people, not only to the Saudis that get in their way, but also to their own people. Yemen is a huge, huge humanitarian disaster. And being on the terrorism list did not affect the ability of the UN or Doctors Without Borders or any of those organizations to bring human aid into Yemen. The Houthis, however, did prevent the UN and Doctors Without Borders from distributing the aid. So they're complaining on the one hand that they have a humanitarian crisis, and on the other hand, they are not permitting the aid in because the aid will then help people that are not the Houthis. So it's a big mess. It's a huge mess. But you have to keep redefining it as the Iranian war in Yemen against Saudi Arabia. Now, what did I mean when I said watch the magician? The United States has real trouble removing sanctions from Iran directly. Biden came in and said that he was going to do that, but there was a tremendous uproar about it among Democrats as well as among Republicans, not to do that, not to bribe the Iranians back into the war. So, okay, so we're not going to do that. But then you have to find another way to show the Iranians that you wanted to be their friends. How do you show them? You take the terrorist designation off their buddies, the Houthis. So while everyone's looking over here and saying, oh, the Biden administration is not taking the sanctions off of Iran. Oh, yes, over here, they're taking the sanctions off the Houthis. It works that way.
Barry Dolan asks as follows, which is a pretty interesting question, actually. Would things be better or worse under a Kamala Harris administration? Always, that's great. That's great speculation. There's a lot of levels there, but we do ask the questions. We don't know how to answer those, really.
See, this is the reason that I don't generally do politics. I do policy,
Right.
not politics.
Right.
But the Constitution says that should Joe Biden not be able to discharge his duties, she will be the president. And so she will. She's not going to have a very long lead rope, however, because when you had Joe Biden elected, without saying a word about Joe Biden, he has a very long history. People know where he comes from politically and in foreign policy, and he has a very, very long history. And you can refer to that if you want to understand Joe Biden. She has much less of one. So if you want to say whether you like him as president or wish he wasn't president, whatever, it doesn't matter. You have to say that Joe Biden sort of had his politics clear in front of you, his foreign policies clear in front of you. Kamala Harris doesn't. And that means that there will be people on Capitol Hill who say of her and to her, you don't get the nod in your direction that Joe Biden got because you don't have a history with Israelis and Palestinians. You don't have a history with Iran. You don't have a history. You're not a negotiator. You have no foreign policy experience. You are a senator who really spent your career doing not very much, actually. So she will not have a very long lead rope. I don't know what that means. I don't know who's going to be running foreign policy then.
Just to the point about Biden and being a long-standing negotiator and expert. What's your take on this interview where he called Putin the killer and said all kinds of stuff, which the whole world got in a buzz about, and Putin got in a buzz, and Putin said, you know, if you throw stones at me, you'll get stones thrown at yourself, and they understand each other, and they have a soul or don't have a soul. What in the world's going on here? What do you
know
think?
what the most interesting part about that was, in my opinion? President Biden has been plagued over the years with charges that he is a plagiarist. More than once, he has been shown to have borrowed language from somebody else. He borrowed that from George W. Bush, who said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. So Biden borrowed the language that I looked in his eyes and I saw that he was heartless or soulless or whatever he was. So I thought the most interesting thing was the plagiarism. I don't see what it gets us. It doesn't make us look tough. It doesn't make us look smarter to be able to embarrass or try to embarrass another leader. There are a lot of things that one can criticize about Russia and about Russian behavior and about Putin's own behavior, that it was unnecessary to say the guy has no soul. I mean, it just doesn't help you. And then Putin said what Putin said, and I don't really care what he says. I care what he does. He's angry, and I don't blame him for being angry. You don't want to be spoken about that way. I don't get it. It's the same as the Chinese thing. I do not understand what Tony Blinken thinks he was doing, preening and puffing up and saying, you know, I'm tougher than you, and I'm better than you, and I'm tougher than you. Like, please give it a rest.
I mean, it tends to undermine the perception of America, as you said, in terms of its stature and position in the world when our leaders are acting that way. You can think it, but you don't have to say it out loud. And after all, president's words are very important. Let me read Stuart Sloan's question, if I understand it. Stuart says, I was in Moscow during the 73 war, meeting dissidents when Kissinger left Moscow empty-handed and US went to DEFCON 4, nuclear alert. Okay. We read that the Russian paratroopers were on transports in a Yugoslav airport and threatened to intervene if Israel didn't stop the encirclement of Cairo. The first ceasefire happened shortly thereafter. Does this coincide with your view of why Israel eventually stopped?
Sure.
Hard question.
Thank you, Stuart. Sure, why not? No, there were two problems. To some extent, Israel didn't want to try to capture Cairo. Could you imagine trying to capture Cairo? Just think about that for a minute. So if you get to blame it on somebody else, that's probably good too. They didn't want to do it. Could they have captured Cairo? I don't even know if they could have. It's enormous. It's amorphous. It's got a lot of people, a lot of moving parts. So I don't really think they wanted to. I think they were happy enough to find a place to stop. Do I think that the Russians were threatening them? Of course they were threatening, and they were threatening the United States as well. So if that's a good reason to stop, then that's a good reason to stop. And President Nixon wasn't crazy about them going to Cairo either.
Now, in terms of Iran, it's an interesting question, but I want to go back to Iran. Anonymous question is about, to just talk about the issue of Sunnis and Shiites in Islam in the Middle East. Does the Iranian Shiite factor, how does that figure in the balance of power and relations between the Arab states and Iran in terms of religious Islam? Where does that all fit? Because Iran seems to be playing a lot of interesting, you mentioned magicians, but they control Iraq, they support Hamas and Hezbollah. They seem to be a non-denominational player. But because when it comes to terrorism, how do you assess Iran's posture in terms of religion and Islam?
So there is very definitely a Sunni Shiite schism. It had been dormant for a very long time. In fact, for a lot of Muslims, it really doesn't bother their day-to-day life. My husband and I sponsored an Iraqi young woman, refugee from the Iraq War. And she told me her mother was Shia and her father was Sunni. I said, well, gee, how did that work out? And she said, oh, nobody cares. Okay. So a lot of people, okay. But the Iranian mullahs, who are not Iranian nationalists, they are not Persian nationalists, they are Shiite hegemonists, stoke that fire because it suits them to do that. It's their goal. It is their desire to have the Shiites, first of all, rule all of Islam, and secondly, to rule all of the world. Now, that's really interesting because Shiites are only about 15% of the Muslim population of the world, not to mention the rest of the world. But chutzpahdik they are, so their biggest problem or their biggest goal is to incite, because they're not very big themselves, even if they get nuclear weapons, God forbid, is to incite instability across large parts of the Middle East and then North Africa and then Europe. And they do that by supporting Sunni jihadists as well as Shiite jihadists. There are not enough Shiite jihadists to create the kind of instability they want to create. And we help them. Taking out Muammar Gaddafi, by the way, who hated jihad, who stepped on jihadists of all sorts, we took him out and we left this enormous morass in the middle of North Africa that is full now of arms and jihadists and unpleasant people, supported by Iran as much as anybody else, even though they're Sunnis, because they create the kind of instability that Iran thrives on. It ties us down. It makes us have to deal with those things. It made the Europeans have to deal with all those refugees. For months and months and months on end, the Europeans did nothing but deal with refugees who were pouring up out of Africa through the hole in Libya into the Mediterranean Sea and up to Europe. So they get a lot of bang from their buck. Do they really think that Shiites are better than Sunnis? Yes, absolutely they do. But do they think that all Muslims are better than all non-Muslims? Yes, also that. So they work at many levels and they're not bad at it.
In terms of Iran, I'm not going to end this program. And as you said before, we have to have you back many times. There's so much to cover. Look, the Iranians have the same approach they had when they got the Iran deal. They said, look, we're going nuclear unless you make a deal. And the only deal we're going to make is about what we made the deal the last time, which of course had more holes than a Swiss cheese. It was a terrible deal. And if you remember, of course, Pompeo's speech to Heritage Foundation, he had 11 or 12 things that he wanted Iran to do, like get out of Syria, stop making ballistic missiles, stop supporting terrorism. Do you think the Iranians will actually get away, another magic program for you to write about, will they get away with this sleight of hand where they can actually go, we're going to go nuclear unless you make a deal. If you make a deal, we're only going to make the deal on the specific things that we dealt with before, but you must get rid of the sanctions first. Can they actually get away with this without doing anything further? What do you think?
No, see, that's a really good question because nobody really knows. It depends on us, actually. It doesn't depend on them as to whether they get away with it. The question is, will we let them get away with it? Here's the one thing that I was unhappy about in the Trump administration. I mean, there were other things too, but two of the biggest things. President Trump should have sent the Iran deal to the Senate as a treaty. And he also should have sent the Paris Climate Accord to the Senate as a treaty, because that gives you the backing of the Senate of the United States, the treaty operator, the treaty ratifier, for whatever it is that you think you need to do. And he should have done that. It's okay, in my opinion, it was okay that he withdrew from the 2005 deal, but the deal should actually have gone to the Senate. Now, the question I have is, what would President Biden agree to if he thought that the Senate would approve it? And what would he agree to if he thought the Senate wouldn't approve it? So everything is in our hands. Would we do it again? There has been a little bit of a change in the rhetoric of the administration. Biden had said initially, the Iranians have to come into full compliance with the 2015 deal. Then we can sit down and work on the next phase of the deal. Now he's saying, well, maybe we can both come back into compliance at the same time. That's a huge payoff to Iran. If that's where he's going and he's planning to pay off Iran to get back into the deal that they weren't in compliance with before, we have a problem. And I don't know where the Senate of the United States is going to be. I do know that there are senators of both parties who do not believe that an Iran deal is a good deal.
We only have just a few minutes, but Sari Salinas has a very interesting question about the hostility between Jordan and Israel. Is there I mean, there seemed to have been a kerfuffle and an issue.
Wait, I missed it. Mark, there was a waiver in your picture.
Sure. Sari Salinas asked, what caused the hostility between Jordan and Israel? This recent kerfuffle, what's going on? Is it long lasting? What's going on here?
What's going on here? Well, the Jordanians are irked because they feel like they should be the most important people. I mean, after all, they should be the most important people. And they don't believe they are because of the UAE and all these other guys. And they don't really like the guys down there in the UAE. And so there's a little bit of pushing by the Jordanians against the UAE. The proximate cause of this was the Jordanian monarchy is the guardian of the mosque at Al-Aqsa. And Jordanian royalty has always been able to come into Jerusalem and go and pray at Al-Aqsa. And the story is, and it's, you know, everybody has their own story, that one of the princes wanted to go to Al-Aqsa, and he brought additional security, armed people. And the Israelis said, no, this is outside of the agreement, and you can't do that. You can only bring what's permitted in the agreement. And the prince got huffy. And in exchange for that, the Jordanians told the Israelis, well, then you can't fly across Jordan to get to your meeting in the UAE. There are some people who said the UAE didn't really want Bibi to come right at that moment because they have an election coming this week, and that they felt that was a little bit too close to the election. I mean, there are all kinds of things that go around it, but the Jordanians are feeling miffed, and the Jordanians are also worried that if the Palestinians don't get an independent state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that the Jordanian monarchy will never be secure. It is not an indigenous monarchy. It comes from Arabia. And they're afraid they'll be shot back down into Arabia and the Palestinians will take over. So they have a lot of concerns. They're not managing them very well. And by the way, let me make a pitch here. The Sparrow pizza bombing, you may remember, in Jerusalem, killed a 12-year-old American girl. And the woman who engineered the bombing, Malki Roth was her name. And as they say in America, say her name, right? Malki Roth, 12 years old, American girl, died in Sparrow pizza bombing. The woman who engineered the bombing lives in Amman. She is a movie star. She's on television all the time talking about how she did the Sparrow pizza bombing. The US has asked for her extradition. The FBI had her on its list of most wanted international terrorists, but she lives under the protection of King Abdullah III, or whatever he is, Abdullah II. We need to tell the Jordanians that they need us for the monarchy to survive, and we need Ahmed Tamimi, Ahlan Tamimi, to be extradited to the United States for the murder of an American citizen. So when you look at what could be done here, and you look at things that the United States government could do to assert itself positively in the region, asking for Tamimi from the Jordanian government is a hot ticket.
Well, we've reached, I regret to say, after an exhilarating presentation by Shoshana Bryen, the end of our time. But of course, we'll have to do this again because there's so much more to talk about. Thank you, Shoshana, for just a wonderful presentation today. And also thank you to all our participants, including from KJ and from the Jewish Policy Center, for joining together today to have the pleasure and the privilege of hearing from Shoshana. Let me wish everyone a happy Passover and all good things in the future, and hopefully peace in the Middle East and in the world. And thank you again, Shoshana, for everything, for the wonderful analysis.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.